Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Hey, Peter, how's it going?
It is great. Thanks for having me on.
Unfortunately for you, as an expert in Austrian monetary theory and banking, it's probably been an insanely busy couple weeks for you.
Yes, it has. What's the Lenin line? Decades happen in weeks. Yeah, it has been absolutely insane. We've gotten sort of the 1970s rolled into 2008 all at once.
A perfect storm, except that it was
There
perfectly
you go.
predictable. Yeah.
Yeah, and you remember that Jon Stewart rant from back in the day?
Yeah.
And that was back when he was funny, and he was talking about the 2008 crisis, and he said, why do we keep having these perfect once in a century, once every 3 millennium storms that keep happening every freaking week? He said, I'm starting to think these aren't perfect storms, these are regular storms, and we have a shitty boat. And that's what we're discovering at the moment. We got a whole lot of crappy boats out there, and so therefore a whole lot of regular storms that are turning into perfect storms.
Yeah. I want to get into the details of the banking crisis and inflation, but maybe let's give folks a baseline. We talk about Austrian economics a lot on this show. I try to keep it as simple as possible, primarily so that I can understand it. But I do feel like there's some particularly, we talk a lot about the libertarian moment, but I feel like this again is the Austrian moment, but it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. We keep explaining to people what are ultimately like very basic concepts, but the government and public policy continues to do the same thing, hoping that it doesn't get worse. But what is it about the Austrian theory of money and banking and the business cycle that give it its predictive power when we see the kinds of things that are happening right now?
Yeah, I think that Austrian at its core, I mean, first off, Austrian is just a continuation of thousands of years of economic thought. It's not some bizarre cult offshoot like Keynesianism is. Murray Rothbard, of course, has his exhaustive study, which is, I mean, it's fantastic if you have an extra summer to read it. And he goes through really, I mean, just thousands of years back, and he sort of traces through all of these different concepts, the just price, the labor theory of value, just all these things. And the point of that is that, economics had figured out how the world works substantially by, say, 1900. We had, accurate models of human behavior. We knew, how to make an economy function. Actually, a lot of things. One of my areas of interest is Chinese economic history, and you can go back to the year 1000, and you had the imperial examinations, and there was a big section in there on economics, and for example, they said if your region has a famine, what's your solution to that? And the answer is that you subsidize transportation into the region, right? So every cart that comes into the area, you give them some silver, and this is sheer genius. That's absolutely correct. Right, that is the best way for a government to actually fix the problem, and it's so sort of mind-blowing to modern eyes because we are so used to just these absolutely idiotic policies where their only response to a crisis is to make it worse. So the moral story is that Austrian economics is simply the evolutionary continuation of thousands of years of economic history that has figured this crap out. Right, and then we had the Keynesian moment where everything went off. We went down this inflationary rabbit hole, inflationism, which has long been a crank theory, generally supported by special interests. Governments love it because it basically says government needs to do more always, no matter what happens. And so I think that where we are at the moment is that we have the truth, we being economics, currently known as Austrian economics. We have the truth, they have the resources, and it's going to be a long battle until there's really two outcomes. Either they screw up so bad that the public just wholesale rejects them and these guys are out of there. You kind of hope that doesn't happen because that implies a whole lot of collateral damage. Or we can convince enough people that, people actually ask their representatives. We can actually elect people who can change it. And, as for Austrian economics, 2008, I think for a lot of people was really the moment when they first heard about Austrian economics, where they first had exposure to these ideas. I myself studied economics in my undergrad up in Canada, and I never heard of Murray Rothbard, Mises. I may have heard of Hayek in the context of his mainstream article about knowledge. I had never heard that there was a school called Austrian. It was not until Mark Skousen, his Making of Modern Economics, when I was like 28, that I even heard that there was an Austrian economics. I mean, it was obscure. And 2008 put us in the moment. A lot of, what we would now call populists opened their eyes to it. And then, of course, you had Bitcoin come along. And so at this point, between the populists and the Bitcoiners, I think for young people, Austrian economics is a real contender.
Yeah, it's so I learned about Austrian economics from reading Ayn Rand when I was a kid, but I stumbled across Grove City College by accident and discovered that the chairman of the department was a guy named Hans Sennholz, who was a student of Mises, and so I had access to these things early on, but it was an accident because there was maybe one or two places in the world where you could study Austrian economics at the time. But a random fun fact: you're at the Heritage Foundation now, and when Murray Rothbard was writing his economic history of the world opus, he was working on the Spanish scholastics and giving a series of lectures at that Mises Institute office that was just a couple doors down from where Heritage is now. So that was we didn't think he'd ever finish that project.
I can imagine. Rothbard is astounding. His conceived in liberty that goes through American history essentially not since the founding, since Jamestown. It's just the detail that's it's really eye-opening.
So I've been talking a lot about Frederick Hayek and the denationalization of money, and particularly that really short clip that we all share so much now, which was, I think that interview was 3 or 4 years after he published the book, and he was imagining that everything that's bad in the universe, I'm only slightly overstating, but everything that's bad in the universe was when government monopolized money, and the obvious way to fix it is to get government out of the business of money, but that's going to be impossible in Hayek's thinking. But we needed some sort of sneaky workaround that would undermine the monopoly power of the not just the Federal Reserve but the whole corrupt system. And I know I bring this up because I know you're also a Bitcoin advocate, and a lot of people say Hayek was not really, but sort of anticipating Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, it's always tricky to say who's anticipating what. In a sense, anybody who believed in commodity money or gold, we could say they were anticipating Bitcoin as well. So setting aside sort of the hair splitting on that, I think in a sense, Satoshi Nakamoto was the embodiment of Hayek's statement there, in the sense that, why was he pseudonymous? Why has he apparently not spent his billions upon billions of Bitcoin? And I think that he anticipated that, taking money away from the state is not something that you can do on your own. They will not let you. They will come after you. He used a pseudonym, presumably because he was aware that he would be arrested. He had reason to think this because, there were many private monies that preceded him, such as e-gold, and what was it? Bernard Nothaus, right? He had the Liberty coins, I think it was, and these were alleged $1 coins that were silver, so their value was on the order of whatever, $20 or $40, and he was threatened with prosecution for counterfeiting. That would be the worst counterfeiter in history.
Yeah.
Right, just prima facie, that's an absurd accusation. But that's how government treats it, because, as dumb as they are in every other area, government understands one thing, and they're very, very good at it, which is seizing and keeping power. So I think Hayek is absolutely correct. There is no way, the only way that you can get government out of money head on is that the government screws up so badly that it collapses. And this is, of course, the history of fiat. It always collapses. And at that point, people look around the wreckage and they try to salvage what's left and they go with commodities. But of course, none of us hoped for that. There will be many, many deaths. And so the alternative is the peaceful revolution. You have to get in under the radar. You have to design something that is so decentralized that they cannot stop it. And, you know, there are many elements of Bitcoin that are absolutely genius, but one of them is the fact that because of its decentralized nature, not only does that make it, you know, such an amazing tool, it just so happens to inoculate it against even the most totalitarian government. China has not been able to stop Bitcoin. It can stop everything. It can stop, you know, sharing Winnie the Pooh memes on TikTok, but Bitcoin it cannot stop.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love Liberty and look cool. So let's take a step back, because I want to end on hopefully some positive, at least proactive steps that people can take to protect themselves. But do you trace the origins of this crisis to the trillions that we spent when we locked down the economy, or do you go all the way back to the bank bailouts of 2008? I know you can go further back, but
yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, you know, you could go back to the first bank of the United States.
Yeah, we can blame Hamilton for all of this, I think.
That's right. It all starts with Hamilton. Yeah, you know, it's always a question of where you go in approximate sense. I think that you want to differentiate between sort of the gasoline and the spark. The spark of the banking crisis, this is kind of built into the system, right? The Fed was created to enable you know, this sort of permanent inflationary regime that's to pay its buddies. And everybody knew that, you know, there are sparks in that process in the form of bank panics. And so, of course, the Fed was founded in order to bail them out. So in a sense, it's an interaction, you know, but if we're looking at sort of the source of this specific crisis, I generally start the story with the Fed financing the lockdowns, right? If we imagine early in the COVID crisis, if we imagine some junior staffer walking in and saying, "Hey, fella," you know, in the Bureau of Economic Management, and saying, "Hey, I've got an idea. We're going to shut down the entire economy. Yes, tax revenues are going to drop in half, but that's fine. We can lay off a bunch of government workers. We don't need them anyway." Okay, so he would have been, you know, exiled to the, you know, to some remote location in Palestine, Ohio, and so instead, of course, right, they didn't have to face that choice. They could shut down the entire world because they had this venture capitalist on hand, sort of the venture capitalist of every crisis, which is at the Federal Reserve, is standing there ready to hide all of the pain long enough that they can do it, right? So whether it's a, you know, war of choice in some remote stan, or whether it was COVID lockdowns, the Fed is their tool to essentially launch the crisis, to hide the costs to the people. Can you imagine if they actually sat down and told the voters, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend $7 trillion. What does that work out to? I don't know, $200,000 per, some large number. So, you know, here's what the bill is going to look like. But, you know, by gum, it's a very, very bad flu. It never would have happened. So I think that really sort of sets the stage. And you know, once you start that, you get this pendulum swinging in all kinds of directions, and very strange things happen. So, of course, one of the things that happens, the inflation took off. The Fed then, you know, had its panic response to that, which was to jack up rates at the highest rates since the 1970s. And then you get that spark shows up, the bank crash. But in a sense, you know, going back to John Stewart's, right, these are regular storms. A lot of these individual things, like if we look at Silicon Valley Bank or Signature or even Credit Suisse or Deutsche, each on its own was a regular storm. You know, Silicon Valley Bank had some jokey loans, you know, friend prices and using the yacht. I mean, whatever. Yeah, there were goofy things that go on. Bankers are not always being monitored very well. But these should have been regular storms. These should just been random, somebody screwed up and somebody lost money. So what is turning these all into this massive crisis? And I think it's that, right? It's that gasoline that's been poured in, where they have so yanked around the economy. They've bent it so many times that now it's breaking.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, and I even had a hard time imagining it. Writing in March of 2020, I found it hard to imagine that when they talked about locking down the economy that they meant it, because it was almost impossible to imagine something we've never tried before. And it turns out that they had two tricks, which was, one is, we're not going to lock down the entire economy, but we're going to protect the laptop class at the expense of people that still had to figure out how to feed them, right? So that it wasn't a real lockdown, but then they monetized it by printing money, which was a huge, maybe purposefully a huge transfer of wealth from the people that were still working to the laptop class that know how to sort of play the system and profit off of inflation.
And what was absolutely key to that is that public opinion throughout that early era was completely with them. You remember when public opinion started shifting, and then all of a sudden they flipped on a dime, right? And people at the time said, "Yeah, well, the science changed, the politics changed," and indeed, the saving grace of politicians is that they're spineless, and so if political opinion shifts, the vast majority of them will shift along with it. But the trick is, early in the pandemic, it was overwhelming. Everybody loved what they were doing, shut it all down, and I think a huge part of that was the massive bribes paid out, right? No questions asked, any benefits you want. Hey, it's a COVID emergency. The stimulus checks. At the time I was in Canada, so they were giving out basically a universal basic income every month, the CERB. And I was writing against the lockdowns. They gave me all the anti-lockdown and anti-COVID stuff because I was American, so I couldn't be canceled. The rest of them were afraid of never working again in the country. But that's what was striking, was I was like, what the heck happened to Canadians? It was like 70, 80% support for this crap. Oh, universal basic income. There you go. Yeah. So the people were effectively bribed to do all this crap, and they were bribed with a puddle of gasoline that is now lighting on fire.
It's kind of a political dilemma, and I can see why individuals who were literally prohibited by the government from working would say, well, I would rather work, but if you're not going to let me work, I guess I should take the check, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. Thomas Massey, one of my favorite congressmen, called it the cheese in the trap. You probably remember this when he was the only guy willing to insist that Congress vote on that first $2 trillion spending boondoggle. But again, and Thomas brags about the fact that he's never read any of the Austrian economists, and he doesn't know anything about Austrian business cycle, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you create $6, $7, $10 trillion out of nothing, that there will be some obvious consequences and even some more nefarious consequences that you've been documenting over these last months as the chickens have come home to roost.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people, if they don't really understand what the Fed does, then it can almost look like a cult, right? We're always like, Bitcoin fixes this, and we're on and on about the Fed, and I'm sure at some level that you guys are obsessed. What are you going to come with the lizard people next? But once you actually understand what the Fed does, how many problems it creates, right? On its own, just offhand, it probably increases the size of the government by half because it makes sort of launching these new crises, launching these new spending programs so painless. It really is like a venture capitalist. They provide the cheese for every war, for every lockdown, for every new program, right? They can make it all painless because it is funded by, basically hiding the cost through inflation, essentially siphoned off every dollar holder in the world. And that will hide it long enough until it can metastasize, at which point it starts causing serious problems. And then, of course, you get the next crisis. And so, you're going to need the Fed to fund that one, get that one stood up and rolling. And so, you end up with this endless series of crises. And of course, from the state's perspective, this is a feature, not a bug, right? Because every single crisis grows the state, right? This is Bob Higgs' crisis and Leviathan. So, whether it's World War I or COVID or, the 1970s inflation crisis, whatever the quote unquote crisis is, every single one of them grows the state. So from the state's perspective, they love this process. They got the Fed to get the thing rolling. Then you get the crisis. Then you blame Putin's price hike and the greedy grocery stores. And then at the end of this process, you get this level up. One of the slides I used to teach at a business school, and one of the slides I used to use was regulations by year. And you can trace this from like 2001 and 2002, 3, 4. You go along, you get more regulations in all these different areas. So financial regulation, labor, environment, and whatnot. And then you get to 2008. In 2008, you get this massive jump, like 30, 40% across the board in all the regulations, including environment. And you might pause for a moment. You might say, well, the 2008 crisis didn't feel like a CO2 crisis. Why did environmental regulations expand? And of course, the reason is that in any crisis, the Overton window pops open. The voters say something must be done, and then politicians show up with something, and that something inevitably swings in one direction, which is the expansion of the state.
And I suspect that we're only starting to realize what's buried in these massive multi-trillion-dollar omnibus bills that, they wait till Christmas Eve and they pass them sight unseen, and I think we'll be discovering for years the toxic regulation that came out of that process.
For sure. Absolutely.
So let's talk about the Silicon Valley Bank and the possibility of contagion and what, from your perspective, caused that. Because I think, we haven't fixed anything since that bailout, and we should be aware of when the next shoe is going to drop.
Yeah, so Silicon Valley Bank had all kinds of salacious details about the quality of their loans and whatnot, but really what drove them under was that the vast majority of their assets, what was in their vault, was in long-term government bonds. And this is what governments tell you to do if you're a banker, because it's the quote-unquote risk-free asset. Which is a kind of a propaganda term on its own.
Are you almost? I have a question on that specific. I feel like the same people that are judging whether or not your investments are sound are telling you that you have to buy their product. Is that is that an overstatement?
No, I think absolutely. Government wants you to buy their shitcoin.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt, you are, funding the venture capital process by investing your money in their asset. And so, Europe is much worse about this. Europe all but requires banks to hold specifically government tokens. And, within cryptocurrency, this is a well-known scam. It's called a token sink, where you create some set of incentives, for example, staking, where you try to encourage people to hold your coin, even though it's worthless. You incentivize them to buy up your coin and then to do nothing with it and just sit there on it. This is essentially every scam in crypto, and there are many scams, has an exact real world analog, and specifically what government does day in and day out with trillions of dollars. But in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, so they held all these bonds because the Fed raised interest rates so quickly, the bonds crashed. So rather than having $1 in the vault, maybe they had 80 cents or 60 cents. So at that point, the bank is technically bankrupt. They have to make an uncomfortable call to the FDIC, at which point they get taken over by the government, temporarily nationalized, and then cleaned up, resolved. And so the issue there is that really what laid them low was the bonds. It was the fact that their entire asset base just eroded, 20, 40%. These were allegedly safe assets, right? So they were treating these as if they were, good as gold, essentially. And that should be concerning because that's also the case across the entire financial system. So the FDIC in December had estimated that there were about $600 billion in such hidden, unrecognized losses in bond portfolios. There were a pair of studies reported in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago that those numbers are closer to between 1.7 and $2 trillion of losses. Now that's a concerning number because sort of public numbers say that there's about $2.2 trillion dollars worth of buffer between what banks owe and what they have. So if indeed those losses, are what, within 90% of what's keeping the banks out of bankruptcy, then yes, it could be a potentially catastrophic problem. Washington Post said that, this is involving hundreds of banks. I think they estimated about 200 banks.
Of course, what the government will say, and Janet Yellen continues to assure us that the banking system is fine, which tells me that it's absolutely not fine, is how I interpret her statement. But of course, there is a de facto promise of a bailout, even though we have all sorts of regulatory structures that are supposed to prevent this kind of mismanagement. But as you say, it's baked into the system. But can they bail out everybody?
Yep. They can bail out everybody by converting it all to inflation. And they can get away with it because, so what happened in 2008 is that they issued all the enormous quantities of money relative to how much money existed back then. And a lot of us warned that it would lead to inflation, and it did not. The reason is because the banks held on to it. Right. So they didn't, take the money and then spend it. They took it and put it in their pocket. And so if banks were to do that again, and, now that they had that enjoyable experience of 2008, sort of from their perspective, a free lunch, right? They could give out trillions of dollars without the inflation showing up immediately. That's no doubt how they'll try to do it again. So they'll try to encourage the banks to act as a token sink and keep all that money in there. And in that case, the inflation won't occur for a while, right? And then as it slowly drips out, you can blame it on whatever happens to be in the news. In the 1970s, for perspective on their ability to find excuses, in the 1970s, when inflation first started taking off, the party line from the Fed at the time, Arthur Burns, was that this was overpopulation and it was the earth running out of resources. And then, of course, it was the Arab oil embargo, right, which was a one-time event. Okay, that doesn't explain a decade of ongoing inflation. So they grab whatever's in the newspapers and they deploy that, and they will do that again, especially if it's gradual enough that it comes back out. So, the Fed, Treasury, they all lie. They're very open about it. They call it guidance, and they write academic papers on this. This is not a conspiracy theory. They celebrate skillful lying, and they guide on inflation. They guide on bank stability. There are leaks just recently that came out from an FDIC meeting a couple months ago where they're sitting there, they're talking to each other about how fragile the banks are. And the one guy says, well, we really shouldn't go public with this, because it might worry the public, because the public doesn't realize, the public thinks the banks are safer than I think many of us in this room do. And the rest of the guys in the room laugh. Right, so this is the FDIC. Now, this was recorded because it was a broadcast to the very, very small number of bankers in the United States who sit there and actually listen to FDIC meetings. So this starts to look an awful lot like an insider club here. We got a bunch of guys sitting around telling jokes how the American banking system is fragile and at risk of collapse. And by gum, don't tell the normies.
Yeah. Of course, the scapegoat today, if you believe Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, is price gouging from greedy businessmen. But that's probably always been a go-to.
Yeah, for sure. And, of course, it begs the question, if oil companies are greedy this year, why weren't they greedy last year? How do we possibly get them to be like those, generous oil company executives of, 2022? So, right, always, it's just an endless series of excuses. One of the popular ones in the 1970s was the grocery stores, which, anybody who's worked in grocery stores should appreciate the humor. Grocery stores have the thinnest margin in creation. I think it's thinner than Uber drivers. Like the notion that grocery stores are sitting around rubbing their palms, squeezing the customer. Do you really want that tomato? How much do you want it? Is comical. But right, they will deploy that. And of course, a cooperative media will amplify whatever they want. thank God that over the past couple of years, enough people have woken up to understand that we're being lied to. If you compare to 2008, for example, Heritage is extremely opposed to every aspect of these bailouts. I think the right, broadly speaking, is extremely opposed to them. And if you compare that to 2008, I think a lot of organizations on the right were intimidated because they had such control over public opinion that they were telling, the American public that the world was about to end. And anybody who had the stupidity to contradict that was going to actually, they would just absolutely be savaged, right? The public opinion could be turned against them at will. At this point, because of the censorship, because of the lies against, Trump, against a variety of social issues these past couple of years, a very large amount of the American population is inoculated, and they finally understand that even if the New York Times and CNN and the Department of whatnot agree on it, it's quite likely still a lie.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. Well, it might actually be a leading indication that it is a lie if they do agree on it.
Right. Well, that's the running joke. Like if you call something a conspiracy theory, at this point, it's a compliment. Conspiracy theorists are sort of the startups of new ideas, right? Every good idea these days has to start as a conspiracy theory.
So on a similar issue, and like when you know nothing about anything and you look at, for instance, current legislation to ban TikTok, which actually turns out to be the new Patriot Act to censor dissident voices on social media, all I had to do was look at Republican co-sponsors and see Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham, and I knew exactly that this was the wrong thing to do and that it would be catastrophic for human liberty. And it's the same on some of these things. Let's dig a little bit deeper, and this gets into a sometimes contentious issue amongst Austrian economists. But I take it that you are from the Rothbard school as a critic of fractional reserve banking, and particularly how this plays into all of this fraudulent banking that we're seeing right now. Explain what fractional reserve banking is and what the Rothbard critique of that is.
So fractional reserve banking is when you deposit your money, and even though you may be under the impression that your money is sitting there like it's a warehouse, or like a farmer taking their grain to a grain silo, right? You might think that your money is sitting there, but actually it's almost immediately lent out. Probably before you exit the bank door, it's gone. And it's lent in loans, or it's sent out in speculation on financial markets, or there's a million things that banks can think to do with your money, but very rarely does it actually sit there and wait for you. And this is a practice that it's really created the financial panics that ultimately led to the Federal Reserve, is banks irresponsibly sort of double promising the money, right? So on the one hand, they lend it out, and then on the other hand, they tell the depositors, oh yeah, you can come by anytime you want. And so my argument is that, this is fraud because they are telling two people that they have the same dollar, right? So it's fundamentally no different than what Sam Bankman-Fried said, where with FTX, where people gave him money and he said, oh, yeah, your money is right here for safekeeping, right here in my pocket. And then, he went out and spent it on, real estate in Bahamas. And what was the pod he had? Anyway, his love family and, whatever their needs were. And so the alternative is, in my opinion, that you structure banking the way that you would structure any other corporation, which is that if the bank claims to have money that you can immediately withdraw, which is called a demand deposit, or most of us would know it as a checking deposit, that actually has to be in cash, not in bonds, alas, not in gold either, because it has to match what the person's taking out. Gold does fluctuate. So demand deposits have to be backed by cash. And then the bank is also free to offer time deposits. So most Americans know this as a CD, a certificate of deposit. And in the case of a CD, those are typically for terms. So it might be 3 months, 1 year, whatever. The bank can freely lend those out. And in fact, it doesn't have to back it with anything. And the structure looks like, say, Ford Motor, right? So Ford Motor has certain things that it owes right now. Okay, it owes a vendor, who delivered Chick-fil-A delivered lunch, and he's waiting for the money. Okay, so it has some money that it owes right this moment. Ford also has other chunks of money that it's going to owe in 10 years, so like a bond. And Ford is not required to set aside a bunch of money for that 10-year bond. Okay, and so I think the full reserve, Rothbard's solution for this instability, this sort of $2 being or a dollar being in two places at once, is to have that clear divide. So empirically, about 20% of the money in the U.S. banking system is in checking deposits. The rest is in saving deposits. If that percentage mirrors, then the typical person would have walking around money, let's say 1 month spending or 2 months, whatever. They would have that in their checking account. That would be actually backed by cash. The rest of it would be in long-term accounts that banks would offer you attractive interest rates for in order to entice you to then allow them to relend it. That would be a completely stable banking system. It would mean that if you had a bank run, that would simply be people withdrawing their cash. Your bank would shrink. You might hope that doesn't happen. You might have an uncomfortable talk at the shareholders meeting, but your bank is not in failure of collapse because you do not owe money that you pretend to have. Now, Caitlin Long out in Wyoming actually tried to do this, Custodia. She had applied for a Fed Master account, which you need to run a bank, and she was suggesting a bank that actually had deposits that were fully backed, and she was refused. And she wasn't given a clear answer why she was refused, but there's a lot of speculation that she was refused.
She needs permission from the Fed or the FDIC, I don't remember.
In this case, it was the Fed that would grant it, but the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was involved. So I don't know who exactly had to sign, or I don't know if the OCC was required to sort of sign the form along the way, but I know that she was in deep discussions with the OCC as well. And so she was refused, and there's speculation, including from her, that part of the reason why is that would specifically put fractional reserve banking in a tight spot because it is inherently bankrupt. By definition, if you owe more money than you have, you are bankrupt. If a bank owes a bunch of money, right, remember, any money that you can go to the bank and get right now is money that the bank is saying they are willing to give you right now. So that is an immediate debt this very moment. Any other company, if you had an immediate debt this very moment and you did not have immediate cash this very moment, we have a word for that, is bankrupt.
Yeah.
And so the concern would be, of course, if you approve one full reserve bank, then, well, people might want to use that, right? Americans might want to protect their life savings. They might want a bank that actually claims what it is. Because in the world we have today, right, what happens instead is that grandma is defrauded, right? So grandma's under the impression that her money is sitting there safe and sound in the bank, that there's a prudent thing to do. I don't want to buy these exotic foreign bonds and whatnot. I'm just going to keep my money in the bank where I know it's there. And the reality, of course, is that her money is invested in exotic foreign bonds. Perhaps it's been invested in venture capital in the crypto industry, such as Silicon Valley Bank. Her money is off in dangerous places doing dangerous things, and she has no idea. Right? If you actually sat down with grandma and you said, why are you investing your money in crypto startups? And she would say, what are you talking about? Because she has no concept how fractional reserve banking works, which is fine. When I have a plumber fix my plumbing, I have no idea how plumbing works. I don't want to know how plumbing works, but I do hope that when he fixes it, he's not actually using some fractional reserve where, he's introducing toxic substances into my drinking water or something. And it should be the same rule in finance, where, banks are actually being honest about this. And so, one of the debates is, well, in a free market, everybody is free to contract anything they want. And, Rothbard's response, which I agree with, is that under a free market, right, under common law principles, in order for a contract to be valid, most sides must actually comprehend the contract. right? If I sell structured finance products to 84-year-olds with dementia, that is going to be considered fraud by any court, anywhere, libertarian or not. And so by the same token, if the average American does not understand how fractional reserve works, if they do not understand that banks do not have their money, and I know they don't understand because we have bank runs, right? If Americans understood that your bank, your money's not there, it's off in Paraguay and it'll come back sooner or later. If they actually understood that, then the bank would run out of money. They'd say, I'm sorry, we don't have any more money. And then everybody would say, oh, shoot, I got to come back tomorrow. It'd be like going to Walmart. They run out of eggs. You say, you'll have eggs tomorrow. Why? Because Walmart is not technically bankrupt at any given moment.
Well, I wonder how much of this, the Concordia example is pretty telling to me, because I think about it slightly differently. And I know this debate, I'm hardly an expert on banking, but it strikes me that the market could heal itself if there was, in fact, fraudulent banking practices happening. And the fact that the Fed won't allow for a more sound banking model to be legal suggests to me that the market could, in fact, fix this without saying you can only do 100% reserve banking. Is that fair? Because it strikes me that the moral hazard here, the problem of Silicon Valley Bank and other banks generally, is that they sort of know in the back of their minds that if they take bigger risks, they might get bigger rewards, and then they'll make more money. Or if things fall apart, they're going to go to the Fed and say, "Save me."
Right. Right. So you could argue for an outcome where it's caveat emptor, and one generation of grandmas must eat cat food to warn the other grandmas. You could indeed argue for that, and that would fix it. It would be sad, the grandmas who took one for the team. But of course, that then begs the question, how realistic is that? So in our political system, right, if you look at this FDIC expansion, for example, it sailed through. Small government ideology and all. So I think at some point you have to negotiate with reality. And, yes, you could imagine getting to a free banking system. The Suffolk system in early American history worked, fantastically. That was a free banking system where the banks were, their prudence was enforced by a single bank called Suffolk that had a very good reputation. It would punish banks who misbehaved. Absolutely, free banking has worked many times in history. Unfortunately, at the moment, we are not angels on the head of a pin. We are asking how to get from here to there. And, there are only two ways to get from here to a Suffolk system. Or really, there's only one way, which is, one generation of grandmas must suffer. That will not happen in our current system. And so the only way that will realistically happen is if the, Ragnarok arrives and a whole lot of grandmas go down, and then we come out the other end and decide that we're not going to imitate the same mistakes. So, I think realistically, yes, in a philosophical sense, if we're all having drinks late at night, absolutely, you could plot a path from here to free banking. I think what's a heck of a lot easier is that you simply, there's a tiny little rule. It's a FINRA rule that nobody ever noticed, and it says you'll experience it if you have like a Schwab account and you want to trade options, or if you want to buy shorts against stocks. Then they'll ask you a bunch of questions like, how long have you been trading? Okay, those are suitability questions. And because of that little tiny rule in FINRA, they have to do that for certain things, because the presumption is that most people don't know what a short is. They don't know what an option or a future is. So the path from here to full reserve simply does that. It says, okay, absent some positive suitability, the assumption is that average people do not understand what fractional reserve is.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. So in a sense, full reserve banking is a politically viable solution to
Bingo.
the corruption of the current system.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I like viable solutions because too often we libertarians sort of fantasize about this perfect world, and I'm like, I'm just trying to get from a moment where we keep spending multi-trillion-dollar spending bills without giving it a thought, and
Yeah.
that would be a win to me if we could stop that.
Yeah, and I'm completely sympathetic. I mean, I have my 10th Amendment fantasies, where I cross out all of the agencies that would be defunded and imagine, I don't know, all of the lattes I would order from the former secretaries of whatnot. I mean, I'm completely sympathetic. I absolutely love fantasizing about the future. Very interested in, sovereign republics or the monarchy solution, all of these. I love them all. However, the specific question, at issue is how do we get from here to there?
And so, what does what do grandmas who are fluent in Austrian economics do to protect their wealth as the government continues to insidiously steal it from us? Give us some proactive things we can do. And I realize you're not an investment advisor, but there are some ideas to protect our downside risk.
Yeah, and by the way, they are grandmas who understand. I have a friend on Twitter called Bitcoin Grandma, so there we go. That is the perfect target market for this advice.
Okay, we're all following her right now.
That's right. Okay, so first, simplest, diversify your bank accounts. That is the easiest way to protect yourself. The bailouts, I think, almost certainly, given the political constraints that we were just discussing, the bailouts will, realistically, everybody will be made whole. Certainly, if you're politically sympathetic, which means if you're working class or middle class, at least in the early stages of a crisis, right? At some point, they come up against other constraints, potentially inflation. So, right, number one, diversify your bank account. Number two, gold, Bitcoin should do quite well. There is the possibility of a dip in either one temporarily on the way to, the crisis. Because debt is canceled and sort of technical reasons. So there's that possibility. Just, hodl. Don't even worry about that.
Yeah.
Both gold and Bitcoin do very, very well in an inflationary crisis. In the 1970s, gold went up 16-fold. Okay. Stocks are not as bad as they look. Again, in the 1970s, inflation went up about 100%. Stocks went up 125%. I'm not a huge fan of holding stocks during crises because I like to sleep at night. So I'd not recommend that. And then, of course, just sort of standard real things, right? So investing in real estate tends to hold up pretty much no matter what. Of course, you have temporary dips like in the 2006 to 8, but compared to holding cash, real estate certainly holds up a lot better. And then, just sort of general sort of TV dad advice, focus on who's close to you. Your network's going to come in handy. The worse things get, the more you care about what's immediately next to you and not about what's remote, right? So the people in your life, your family, your neighbors, your network of friends, the people who can help you out if you're in need, those all, sort of take over your entire world. That's pretty much all that matters. So it's a good time to spend time with them, invest in them to a certain degree, turn off the TV and sort of focus on that.
Yeah, that last part is very good advice. One last technical question. So I view Bitcoin and gold as hedges against tyranny, and maybe not, like, I don't view it as part of an investment portfolio per se. And I'm very much a long run person. I don't even look at my stocks on a daily basis because you would just go crazy. But you have also emphasized, and a lot of people emphasize the fact that you need to control your own wallet, and you need to make sure that you're actually owning the assets, not in a third party situation.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I love about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is inherently full reserve banking. If you're self-custodying, in other words, if you are controlling the keys to your Bitcoin, broadly speaking, two things on Bitcoin. Number one, if you don't understand it or you're not absolutely passionate about it, then do not buy any more than a play around amount. Okay, and the reason is that if you don't truly love it, then Bitcoin goes up and down a whole bunch, very famously. hodl, hold on for dear life is what describes the life of a Bitcoin owner. You will sell in a panic, right? Guarantee you will absolutely sell low. So do not buy substantial amounts until you absolutely understand. You have to love it. You have to be out there saying Bitcoin fixes this on Twitter before you're ready to buy substantial amounts. If you're not there yet, put it in gold. Gold is pretty much the same thing. It doesn't move as much, but you're going to get to the same destination. And I'm sorry, was there another part to that, or did I?
No, I think that's as long as you're. I don't quite understand this process for gold, but you want to actually own gold as opposed to.
Yeah, gold is a lot trickier, and this is part of the reason that I do like Bitcoin so much. And I love gold. I mean, I've loved gold my whole life. If we, switched over to gold, I would be perfectly thrilled. But gold's fundamental issue, its fundamental weakness, is that it is physical, ironically enough. And because it's physical, it has to be stored somewhere. And the costs of securing gold means that gold storage tends to be extremely centralized, right? It's some sort of castle with a moat, with sharks, with lasers. And so that means that it's uniquely vulnerable to the state, right? The state can find the gold hoards because they have addresses and they advertise.
They've done it before, yeah.
They have done it before. And, this is, anybody who loves gold, sort of the natural question would be, okay, if gold is so great, where is it, right? Where are the countries that are currently using gold? And of course, the answer is none. Now, that's not because gold sucks. It's because gold has a fatal vulnerability, which is that it is exposed to government seizure and therefore government control. Bitcoin, to me anyway, one of its just absolute genius aspects is that it cannot be controlled. It cannot be shut down. As long as there are two humans in the world who are willing to communicate via Morse code in Zodiac boats off the coast of Bolivia. Wait, okay, Bolivia doesn't have a coast. Nice try. As long as there are two humans using Bitcoin, it survives. It is very, very impressive as a technology. It's fundamentally state-proof. So, if we get to the destination and, people finally give up on fiat, if this happens in the near future, then I would assume that gold is going to be the successor. People are more accustomed to it. Very, very few people understand Bitcoin enough to make it stable. Right. If only 1% of people are sort of trading in and out of something, it's not going to be stable. And so until a lot more people understand it, it's not really going to be great money. It's sort of a speculative money. But I mean, of course, having said that, gold is also speculative money, right? If you look at gold since it was fully demonetized by Nixon, there are years where gold has almost doubled, over, say, a 3-year period in price. And there are years where it's fallen by almost half over a 3-year period. Now, anybody who doesn't know history would look at that and say, oh my God, gold is useless as a currency. Who wants a currency that's going to lose half its value in 3 years? You got to be joking. What are you guys drinking? But of course, the answer is, well, yes, any asset, if it is monetized, because it is the monetized asset, it has this extremely deep base of demand, and so it would tend to be very stable. So, of course, if gold were monetized, it would cease jumping, 50% every 3 years, and it would be stable. And similarly, there will come a day, perhaps in 50 years, where enough people understand Bitcoin that it might go there. But anyway, that's a long ways off. And so if the crisis happens the next 10, 20 years, then I would expect that we would go to gold. And then I expect that, gradually Bitcoin would continue taking market share from gold, not all at once, but, over a 10 or 20 or 30-year period. If, on the other hand, we're stuck with fiat for another 30, 40 years, then I would guess that we just go directly to gold and skip the middleman.
Okay, so I love your short videos on Twitter, but why don't you tell people where they can find your writings, your videos, and actually what you do at Heritage, I guess.
Sure. Let's see. I'm on Twitter at Profstonge, Profstonge. I've also got a Substack, which is what the heck is it? Substack. Where's my thing? saintonge.substack.com. That's what it is. Got videos over at YouTube as well. So check those out. If you've been off social media because of the censorship, Twitter is lit. I highly recommend going back there. Elon looks legitimate. And then as far as heritage, come visit us. We have a really, really good team of based economists. We, very deeply oppose pretty much everything about the Biden regime and the Federal Reserve and the, horrible things that it's doing to the world. So I hope that you'll visit us at heritage.org.
Cool. Thank you, Peter. This has been helpful.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.